Good morning. This is our fourth message in our series of messages on what happened to the followers of Jesus during World War I. If you remember our last message, we looked at the Espionage Act of 1917 and its related amendments of 1918. This law restricted the freedom of speech and freedom of religion. And we looked at some examples of how that was applied to people in general, society in general, with the IWW and Eugene Debs. Today, we're going to look at how those laws were applied to followers of Jesus, people who spoke out against the war, who spoke out against purchasing liberty bonds and war bonds, and what happened to them. We're going to start off with an authentic audio clip that talks about something that plays a major role in this type of persecution. We're going to look at this clip right here. I want to thank Daniel Willis and my father for helping me get this audio clip. It's an audio clip from October 30th, 1942. Yes, it's an audio clip from World War II, but the audio clip helps us set the stage for the same thing that happened in World War I. So we're going to listen to that audio clip right now.
Faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, able to leap tall buildings at a single bound. Look, up in the sky, it's a bird.
It's a plane.
It's Superman. Yes, it's Superman, strange visitor from another world, who came to Earth with powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal men. Superman, who could change the course of mighty rivers, bend the steel in his bare hand, and who, disguised as Clark Kent, mild-mannered reporter for a great metropolitan newspaper, fights a never-ending battle for truth, justice, and the American way. But before we join Superman, here is an important message.
Fellows and girls, every day the city, state, and national offices of civilian defense organizations are swamped with letters from young people like yourselves. And most of the letters ask, what can I do, what part can I take in the national war effort? The writers of these letters are all too young to join the United States Armed Forces, too young to join any of the numerous home defense groups, and yet they ask, isn't there something we can do? Some of you listening now are no doubt among those who have written those letters, and I'll bet many of you who have not written have thought the same thing. Well, the answer is a very simple one, and here it is. You can do your part in civilian defense. You can help win this war by buying war-saving stamps regularly. How does that help, you ask? How can my dime, or 20, or 40, or 50 cents help to win this war? That's easy, too. For instance, your dime, just 10 cents, will buy 5 .45 caliber bullets that can be used by our soldiers, sailors, or Marines to knock 5 Japs or 5 Nazis out of commission. And believe me, it's going to take a lot of those bullets to knock them all out and win the war. Another thing, 50 cents, which represents 5 10 or 2 25-cent war-saving stamps, will buy enough fuel oil to bring one of our destroyers a full mile closer to the Jap fleet in the Solomon Islands. And you know what happens when our Navy gets close enough to turn on the heat. And here's one more thing for you to think over. If every fellow and girl in the United States bought at least 5 10-cent war-saving stamps every day, the amount of money they would lend to the government would buy enough fighter planes and bombers to blast Hitler's Luftwaffe right out of the air. So remember that each and every dime is important, that buying war-saving stamps is a very important way to help win this war. So keep in mind this slogan. Repeat it often to your family and friends. Every time you've got a dime, buy a war-saving stamp. And now, the adventures of Superman. When Editor Perry White received an urgent letter from his French-Canadian friend...
Did you catch what was said? You might have to listen to this more than once, but it's a pretty powerful message what a war-saving stamp or war bond could do, as explained in this Superman. The Superman episode was number 5 from what was called The Headless Indian, October 30th, 1942, just for your information. Did you catch what he said? 10 cents will buy 5 .45 caliber bullets to knock 5 Japanese or 5 Nazis out of commission. Isn't that an interesting way to say let's kill them? Did you catch what also he said? 5 10-cent war savings stamps will buy enough fuel oil for one of our U.S. destroyers to go 1 mile closer to the Japanese fleet in the Solomon Islands and to turn on the heat. A nice way to say, let's go to battle and destroy them. In the last one, he said if every boy and girl in the United States would buy at least 5 10-cent war savings stamps every day, it would provide enough funds for the United States government to buy fighters and bombers to blast Hitler's Luftwaffe right out of the air. Again, let's kill and destroy them. Like I said when we listened to this helps us wrap our minds and heads around what a war bond is, what a war savings stamp is, and what it can do. In World War I, it was considered your patriotic duty to purchase a war bond. And if you didn't buy one, you were considered to be very suspect and suspicious. Let's look at what a Liberty Bond or Liberty Loan is. A Liberty Bond or Liberty Loan was a war bond that was sold in the United States to support the Allied cause in World War I. Subscribing to the bonds became a symbol of patriotic duty in the United States and introduced the idea of financial securities to many citizens for the first time. There were 4 Liberty Loan drives and a Victory Loan drive, which occurred after the armistice on November 11, 1918. The first Liberty Loan drive is April 24, 1917. The second, October 1, 1917. The third, April 5, 1918, which is about the same time as we are now. The fourth Liberty Loan drive, September 28, 1918. And the fifth Liberty Loan drive, or the Victory Loan drive, was April 21, 1919. The U.S. Department of Treasury made it easy for everyone in the United States to buy Liberty Loans or war bonds. War bonds were sold in denominations as low as $50. But the United States Treasury Department made it even easier by offering war savings stamps to the public. With war savings stamps, the U.S. Treasury Department has made it available to every man, woman, and child in the United States a way to purchase profitable, simple, and secure investments. In the Superman, you could buy a 10-cent war stamp in World War II. However, the lowest denomination in World War I was 25 cents. 25 cents doesn't sound like a lot of money in our day. But in 1917 and 1918, 25 cents is worth more like $6 in our money today. Yes, it did cost a little bit. Nearly everybody could purchase what was called a thrift stamp for 25 cents. You would receive a thrift card and you would collect your thrift stamps. When you received 16 of them, your thrift card is now worth $4. You could exchange that thrift card plus a little bit of cash for a $5 war savings stamp. For example, you would need to add 12 cents plus your completed thrift card for the exchange for a war savings stamps before February 1st, 1918. War savings stamps were sold at a discount. The war savings stamps then were affixed to a war savings certificate which earned interest. When you had collected 20 of them, your war savings certificate would be worth $100 at maturity, which was on January 1st, 1923. As I said, it made it easy for the everyday person to purchase and support the war. We're going to now change what Superman said you could purchase with those war savings stamps and war bonds into what you could purchase with them in 1918. We're going to look at an official bulletin, which is a U.S. government publication dated March 21st, 1918. Let's just see what you could purchase with the thrift stamp or war savings stamp. A single thrift stamp, which costs 25 cents, will buy a tent pole or 5 tent pins, a waist belt or hat cord, shoelaces, or identification tags. One war savings stamp, or $5, will buy 100 cartridges or bullets, or a cartridge belt, or a scabbard for a bayonet. Again, When you're purchasing these war bonds, war saving stamps, or thrift stamps, you can know what it is being used for. Let's look at a picture of a war bond itself. This is from the Second Liberty Loan. If you can see, it says Second Liberty Loan converted 4% gold bond of 1927 and 1942, which is when you could start turning them in for maturity. A question you might have: am I, as a follower of Jesus, required to buy a war saving stamp, or thrift stamp, or war bond? And my answer is no, we are not. We are commanded to pay our taxes, but we are not commanded to directly support war by purchasing a war bond. Again, remember, these war bonds and thrift stamps and war saving stamps were voluntary. However, it was made very easy to purchase them. You could purchase war bonds, war saving stamps, and thrift stamps at your local bank. You could buy war saving stamps and thrift stamps at your local post office. And even stores began having booths that were more or less a bank booth inside the store where you could purchase war bonds when you went shopping, such as at the department store and perhaps the grocery store. As I said, we as followers of Jesus are not required to purchase war bonds. In World War I, the purchase of war bonds was, on paper, voluntary. And in most circumstances and communities, it was. But there were circumstances where more or less it became mandated or mandatory to purchase them. And we will look at some examples of those in my next message. Please don't misunderstand me or misquote me. We are required by and commanded by Jesus to pay our taxes. Let's look at that scripture. We're going to read from Matthew chapter 22, verses 17 through 22. And this, if you remember, this is when the Pharisees came to Jesus, tempting or testing him about is it lawful to pay our taxes to Caesar. Let's read those scripture verses. Tell us, therefore, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? But Jesus perceived their wickedness and said, Why do you test me, you hypocrites? Show me the tax money. So they brought him a denarius. And he said to them, Whose image and inscription is this? They said to him, Caesar's. And he said to them, Render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. When they had heard these words, they marveled and left him and went their way. As I said, I take it very strongly that Jesus commanded us to pay our taxes with this scripture and the related scriptures that you find in some other verses in the Gospels. But we are not commanded to buy war bonds or war saving stamps or thrift stamps. And as I said, it was a big deal in World War I, slightly less in World War II. But it was the public and the society considered it a sign of our patriotic duty to get behind our troops, to support our nation at war. Let's look at some of these posters. I've shared some before in the previous messages, some of these posters that showed about war bonds and thrift stamps, Liberty loans, but then we're going to look at some here again today. Again, these posters emphasize get behind our nation, get behind the troops to support them. The first one we'll look at is this one. And we'll zoom in. I'll just read it real quick. You buy a Liberty bond, I'll do the rest. This was on a street corner. Another one, I just found this one last night. This one, again, emphasizes what we're talking about. The Kaiser's coffin, come in and help bury the beast of Berlin. And according to the notation, if you bought a war thrift stamp or war savings stamp, you could go inside that tent and hammer a nail into a coffin. I don't know what the point of that was, but like I said, it is appealing to people's patriotism. Here's another one. Are you 100% American? Prove it. Buy U.S. government bonds, Third Liberty Loan. Again, emphasizing that if you don't buy the bonds, you are not a loyal American. This one is playing on the patriotism. Look at a little boy and his sister. Our daddy is fighting at the front for you. Back him up. Buy a United States government bond of the Second Liberty Loan of 1917. Playing on our emotions. Another one. Women, help America's sons win the war. Buy a United States government bond, Second Liberty Loan of 1917. Again, playing on our emotions. emphasizing our patriotic duty to support the war. This one is just like what the Superman advertisement said. This one exactly says what war bonds do. Ammunition. And remember, bonds buy bullets. And that is a very key word. Bonds buy things to destroy other people. And we as followers of Jesus don't get involved in that. Two other little verses, this is brief verses about Jesus' teachings on two kingdoms of non-resistance. I'll just reaffirm as we're looking at this topic. John 18, verse 36. Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here." And a related passage that we're all familiar with, Matthew chapter 5, verse 43 through 45. "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For he makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust." As we know, there's many verses talking about this. We're going to now look again at this brief overview again of the espionage law and its sedition amendments that made it illegal to talk negatively about war bonds and illegal to technically talk negatively about not serving in the military. Just to refresh our memory. This is specifically talking about war bonds. I got this exactly verbatim from the law. It says, whoever, it should say says, or does anything except by way of bona fide and not disloyal advice to an investor or investors with intent to obstruct the sale by the United States of bonds or other securities. Specifically saying it is against the law to speak against the war bond. We remember this one. Whoever, when the United States is at war, shall willfully cause or attempt to cause or incite or attempt to incite insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, or refusal of duty in the military. Whoever shall willfully obstruct or attempt to obstruct the recruiting of or enlistment service of the United States. And this one again, speaking out against the war. Whosoever willfully utter, print, write, or publish any language intended to incite, provoke, or encourage resistance to the United States. It was applied to people who spoke against the war. Last time we looked at, like I said, the IWW and Eugene Debs. Today we're looking at how these laws were applied to. Today we're looking at 3 pastors. And then a following message we'll look at 4 examples. Okay. Well, if you remember the imprisonment, and that was a pretty stiff imprisonment, shall be punished by a fine of not more than $10,000, which is approximately $198,000 of our money. That's the fine, or imprisonment for no more than 20 years, or both. Just imagine if you say going to war is wrong, you could get sent to jail for 20 years. That's a long time, and it did happen. We'll look at one of those examples today. So I'm going to go read this quote from this newspaper. It helps us, in my mind, solidify the ultra-patriotic spirit that you saw in the United States at this time period. I showed the slides, if you remember last time, everything they were doing, this is to drum up this patriotism, this euphoria against the Germans. But here's not a nice article, but it emphasizes this overall spirit. I don't know if you can read it up there. You can't, but I will read what it says. The top says, "A gaff for freaks and flackers." The Solomon Tribune, Dixon County, Kansas, Thursday, September 5th, 1918. And listen to what it says. It's talking about us here in this congregation and how we are viewed and other people like us. When the Lord made Adam, he made a woman. Then he made he made a man. Then he made a woman. A helpmeet, true, and said to them, "Do the best you can, and that is all I ask of you." So the world of men and women began with just one woman and just one man. But who the devil do you suspect ever started the crazy, cowardly, fightless sects? One set of chumps called Hutterites, and one mess of cowards, the Church of God. Both are so ornery, they won't even fight, even though an enemy invade our sod. Independent Bible students who read and sigh and croon. Also the spineless Friends, Quakers, and Mennonites. All are expressed by cowardly patroon because they are too ornery to fight. A man who won't fight to defend his home has empty rooms in his noodle dome. And if each will wash off his yellow stains, I'll give him a nickel to buy some brains. Or if that's too strong for the cowardly ilk, we'll fill his block with mush and milk. For anything, however cheap, would beat the ones on the cowardly sheep. A man who will dodge behind such flimsy flim-flam and refuse the act a part of a citizen true and fight for home and Uncle Sam, listen to this word, ought to be bayoneted through and through. This is what they're talking about us in this congregation, that we should be bayoneted because we do not want to fight. This is a pretty powerful statement. What right has a man to embrace a creed and wear long hair and whiskers too, by which to shirk in time of need and the duties of a citizen loyal and true? Every true man feels a loathing disgust for the varmint without brains or sand. So, Uncle Sam, we ask you to bust this crazy, freakish, cowardly band. Compliments to conscious objectors, Dr. I.B. Julian, Salina, Kansas. He said that's a real article that was written against people like us who refuse to take up swords and fight to defend this nation. And I know it's kind of, quote, funny. He calls us cowardly ilk, fill our block with mush and milk, but he wasn't saying that to be funny when he wrote that article. We're going to look now at the three examples I'm going to share today. It will be one of a Church of the Brethren pastor and what happened to him when he spoke about war bonds and Christians killing other people. And the second example will be about two Mennonite ministers and virtually the same thing that happened to them. So let's look at this first person. His name was Brother David Garrity's, Church of the Brethren pastor. I'm going to be sharing from his own testimony and from other newspaper articles and things that fill in the story. This is what he said about war bonds. When the request came to invest in Liberty bonds, it was stated how much ammunition and equipment the several stated amounts would purchase. I concluded, since there was no law requiring subscribing to this fund, that I as a Christian could not consciously and voluntarily invest in such bonds. And I agree with him. We should not have been buying those bonds. But the story gets worse from this. On June 18, 1918, he writes this: in the church of which I was and am now the elder in charge, there was a brother and sister, I think another elder, as far as I can tell, who were more patriotic than spiritual, and that took advantage of what I said in the council meeting. This is what Brother Garrity says. When urging my brethren to missionary effort, I said I knew some of the brethren were investing in bonds and some were not. But that whatever they did conscience, that's a hard word, conscientiously. That happened to me yesterday too. I gave my position on bonds as I had previously stated. But what makes this story more sad, as he says, I'll go back to the previous slide, there were people in the church who opposed him. And guess how it got, as far as I can tell, got to the federal government that was speaking against war bonds. It wasn't by the outsiders. It was by his own church family who turned him in to the federal government speaking against bonds. And I think that is pretty horrible. Just imagine that we had somebody in our own congregation who would turn us in because they disagreed with what we were teaching. On July 5th, 1918, my son Wayne and I appeared before the Board of Exemption, this is referring to a draft board, of Freeport, Illinois. My son was released being a minister. I was in question and told my position relating to war. I was told that I did not believe the Bible. I was questioned about statements I made at that prior meeting. I was told my statements would be held against me. How would the draft board know what he said at a private church meeting? That's why I said somebody in their own congregation reported him to the authorities. I feel that is, how wicked can you be? Here's some of the stuff I found in the newspaper about him. This is the newspaper called the Daily Gazette, Sterling and Rock Falls. This newspaper, I'm going to zoom in just so you can see a little bit. This was July 8th, 1918, about that, like a day or two later. Let's zoom in. You can probably see it. Is opposed to war and bonds. Reverend David Garrity's brethren pastor at Melbourne, taken before district board. Spoke against Red Cross. reported to war officials, federal authorities to investigate the case. Like I said, who told the federal authorities that? Who told the draft board? Those were private conversations in his own church. This is what he said in that paper, because you can't read it. This is what his remark was that they quoted him for saying. I told my people that I'd rather take up arms and shoot people than to purchase Liberty bonds. This is how strongly he felt about buying them. And I would agree with this comment. When you hear the Superman, that these buy bullets to kill people, I would agree. You don't purchase them. And this remark was made that Saturday, the July 8th, before the district board at Freeport by Reverend Garrity's pastor of the Church of the Brethren of Malvern, Illinois. 3 days later, this is the paper, July 11th, 1918. If you look down right here, we'll zoom in again. Reverend Garrity is in hands of law. We'll zoom in. Malvern minister seized by U.S. Deputy Marshal and taken to Freeport. Faces serious charges. And this is what David Garrity's testimony was. Some days later, after that meeting, our county sheriff and federal official called at my home. I was presented with a warrant for my arrest for willingly, knowingly, and feloniously obstructing the draft. And that's for, like I said, speaking about why war is wrong in your own church. Didn't even do that on the street corner or something. So we're going to go to the next one. This is July 17th. Look up in the corner. Minister held to grand jury. U.S. Commissioner, after preliminary hearing, fixes his bail at $5,000. This is what it says, is David Garrity's testimony. On my return home after posting bail, I went to Morrison and engaged legal counsel. On the following Monday, went to Freeport for my preliminary hearing and was bound over to the federal grand jury, which rendered an indictment. The indictment under the Espionage Act. The Espionage Act, if you remember what it said, you couldn't speak against war bonds. You couldn't say that. This newspaper, I'm zooming in, it fixes the date of his trial. The Daily Gazette, Sterling, Illinois, November 2nd, 1918. We'll just zoom in a little bit. If you look up there, fixed date of trials for federal court. Case of Reverend David Garrity's of Malvern will be heard at Rockford, Illinois, Thursday. From David Garrity's own testimony, his trial was on November 13th, 1918 in Rockford, Illinois, with Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis presiding. This is the same judge presided over the IWW trial earlier that year and who threw the book at the IWW. So I don't think he's going to have any mercy on in his mind, a disloyal American. This was one of the statements that David Garrity's a first-person account of one of the statements that was asked to him by the judge. I was asked to make a statement by the judge about what I had said on Mother's Day 1918. I gave an account of my statement on that day that it had been said by a woman that it was too bad to raise boys for cannon fodder. I said that mothers should raise boys for the Lord, that if all mothers had raised sons for the Lord, this great war would be impossible. How did the judge know about that? I asked. This, again, was a private sermon at someone's private church. Now, this next couple slides, I want to thank Josiah Murray for helping me with, if you remember, making that PDF where we could read it. Thank you again. This was from the Marengo Republican News, Volume 51, Issue 35. They published, this is after the trial is over, but it's giving a synopsis of what happened. December 19th, 1918. And I'm going to read a series of questions that Judge Landis asked David Garrity's and other witnesses during the trial. We all have thought about what-if statements. What would you do if somebody attacked you or your family? Well, that's what Judge Landis asked all these people. And here's some of their responses. You look at the little picture. No, I think he's referring to that picture making fun of David Garrity's. No matter what a Hun did to my daughter, I couldn't kill him, never. Let's read the article together. What is the price of a man's immortal soul? Rockford, Illinois. The trial of Reverend David Garrity's, pastor of the Whiteside County Church of the Brethren, packed Judge Landis' courtroom. Garrity's, when he pleaded guilty, told Judge Landis that even if a Hun were to attack his own daughter, he would not slay the ruffian to protect her honor. The court then asked similar questions of Garrity's brother and of Joseph Longnecker. Both said that in such a case they would plead that in God's name their daughter be spared. To kill a man would to imperil their souls. Is your soul worth more than your daughter's honor? Asked the court of Longnecker. It is worth more than all. And this is what all the stuff said. Judge Landis did not like that statement. So he says, take them out of the courtroom, he said. These men hold their measly little shriveled souls of more importance than they do the honor of their mother, wife, or daughter, said Judge Landis to the next witness, Herman W. Pratt, who did not believe in non-resistance. What I'm trying to find out, is there any other member with similar views? Pratt said he would take chances on the salvation of his soul and defend his daughter to the death. This was another person at Church of the Brethren. And we're going to skip over and look at another testimony of another person who's most likely one of the ones who turned David Garrity into the authorities. Mr. Grader, an elder in the Church of the Brethren, was called to the witness stand. He was positive the church did not teach non-resistance to the extent mentioned. He had opposed this belief and had made a number of enemies as a result. And this is what he says he would do if somebody was attacking his family. This is what the court asked him. Would you use a dandy 36 Colt, one which could bore a hole through a 6-inch board if were necessary to protect your mother or daughter, or would you make certain of saving your soul? Inquired the court. And his answer satisfied the court and spectators that the Grader family is headed by a man who is firm in the belief that family protection comes ahead of everything. The typical response. And that's what the court wanted to hear. If you remember, it actually asked to dismiss the people who were teaching on resistance. So let's go back to that other article. Starting where it says Judge Landis. Judge Landis, after declaring that the Brethren Church had its origin in Germany, reviewed Garrity's anti-bond talk in his opposition to the Red Cross. The defendant and his family were not averse, however, to selling their hogs at wartime prices, said the court. And therefore, Judge Landis sentenced Reverend Garrity's to how many years? Do you see it? 10 years in Leavenworth Federal Prison. For talking in your own church as wrong to buy war bonds, it's wrong to kill other people. He was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for saying that. That is a long time if you think about it. We were talking about suffering in Sunday school. Well, I think he suffered there for speaking about God and what Jesus wants us to do. Well, let's look at some more stuff about him. We're not quite done. Then I found this statement by a local newspaper, and that same one, the Daily Gazette. Let's read what it says about David Garrity after this. This is just talking about him. Again, this is just breaking in. Again, in the dark days of the rebellion, our fathers fought and shed their blood, that this nation might continue whole and continue free. They shed their blood that Reverend Garrity and all of his people might have the liberty to worship God according to the dictates of their conscience. But they did not fight and shed their blood to give Mr. Garrity or any others the right to enjoy the freedom of this land and maintain a course that would help another power that was trying to destroy that freedom. That our freedom of speech, our freedom of religion was conditional if we do not, according to this newspaper article, if we are not willing to help fight and defend it. It is regrettable that the minister of the gospel should be so misled and so try to mislead his people. Reverend Garrity's received no more than he had a right to expect. And that's that. What do you expect? If you're going to teach that, you're going to get it. So we're going to just finish him up real quickly. He was sent to Fort Leavenworth, which is in Kansas. That's one of the original block buildings. But it doesn't end there, thankfully. This is Rock Island newspaper, Thursday, May 8th, 1919. We're going to zoom in here. Probably can't read it, but it says 50 held under Spy Act free, acting on recommendation of Attorney General President Wilson grants clemency. 50 more men convicted of violation of the Espionage Act have been granted clemency by President Wilson on recommendation of Attorney General Alexander Mitchell Palmer in pursuance of the recently announced policy of being lenient to those who had served a year in prison. And David Garrity's, it's mentioned right there, David Garrity's Northern Illinois, 10 years, 1 year, 1 day. So he was one of the ones that President Wilson offered clemency. So we'll look at that here. On June 11th, which was about a month after this, I was called before the deputy, this being at prison, and told since I had a very short time to stay that I would receive a star attached to my uniform, I would be made a trustee, I would be placed outside the inner compound of Leavenworth to work on the farm. David Garrity's was also given privileges for Sunday school and for church service. Because being a minister, he was able to actually help conduct them. He also worked in the kitchen just like Vern Kessler had done when we spoke about him. Finally, on September 8, 1919, a little less than 10 months when he was sentenced, he arrived back at home, as it said, on April 9th, to a wife and daughter who had suffered much from their sad experience. That ends the story of David Garrity's, but this is something I thought about. You speak the truth in your own church, and you're turned in to the federal authorities by people from your own church, and you get sent to jail. On paper, it would have been 10 years. Thankfully, it was only 10 months. Now let's go to the last story, the two Mennonite ministers. This is a story of Ryan Benner and Louis Heatwell. Some of you might be familiar with them, and some of you are not. And I want to thank different people who helped me on this, the Eastern Mennonite University Archives and the Coffin Museum in Kansas for helping me with some of this information. I have lots of primary source information on this one. Here's the story. As you see, Pastor Ryan Benner was a missionary pastor stationed in the Mennonite Mission Home in Job, West Virginia. Bishop Louis James Heatwell was the bishop of the congregations of the Middle District in the Shenandoah Valley, Virginia. He was responsible for Job, West Virginia mission. So here's what happened. In the early summer of 1918, this was early June, Pastor Benner had heard a rumor that you would be required to attend the local precinct meeting and say how many war stamps or bonds you would be buying. He didn't know what to do. So he did what we would do. He asked the church leader for counsel. So we'll look at a picture of him, Ryan and Anna Benner, with their children James and Rhoda, 1917, courtesy of the descendants of Ryan W. Benner. There's a picture of him and his wife. And here's a picture of Louis Heatwell. And then we're going to look at this letter here on the side in the second. So Ryan Benner wrote a letter to his bishop, Heatwell, Brother Heatwell, and asked him, what do you recommend he do? So this Heatwell wrote this letter back, this one right here, back to him. I will read the letter. Dale Enterprise, Virginia, July 15th, 1918. As far as I can tell, because Heatwell was in a rush, he got a typo that should say June 15th, 1918, according to Brother Benner's testimony. Dear Brother Benner, greetings. Your letter of the 11th is here, though seemingly a long time on the way, no less than 3 days and over. The clipping I enclose is no doubt a similar proclamation by the governor of your state. The tenor of this proclamation is that all people of the state and nation exercise the spirit of self-sacrifice, in parentheses, good, to pledge themselves to economy and thrift for the balance of the year, also good enough. The next one, to buy to the extent of their means as evidence of their patriotism, war saving stamps for support of our boys in France. Here comes the test. The advice given by our brethren of the General Conference Committee is that our brethren do not aid or abet war in any form, receive no pay while held in detention camps, contribute nothing to a fund used to run the war machine. In a number of places where brethren have refused to contribute to the Liberty Loan, Red Cross, or war saving stamps, outlandish threats have been made and in a few cases have been put into execution, such as tar and feathering, painting houses yellow, they did that a lot, decorating autos and buildings with flags to test them on their principle of non-resistance. I have continued to give the advice of the General Conference Committee, the brethren here, and would do the same to our brethren in West Virginia, were I there, and I take the consequences whatever they may be. Some of our brethren have yielded under pressure. Others have subscribed to the Red Cross funds and taken out war saving stamps, but of these, so far as I know, there are only a few. If our brethren in camp can stand true to the faith of the gospel, why should not we at home bear part of the pressure? You will see by the last Gospel Herald that there is now a ray of hope for the boys in camp. Shall we not be rewarded for our faithfulness if we remain true as they have done? Hurriedly, signed L.J. Heatwell. And that's why when he says hurriedly, I think he's, like I said, he got a typo when said July, because Benner's testimony was it was June 15th. Whoops. So what happened with that letter? Benner received it. He wrote other letters. It's in Benner's testimony. He rode on horseback for 4 days and 4 nights in rural West Virginia, distributing Benner's letter to different members of the congregation. And for those he couldn't get to by horseback, he mailed 14 letters by the post office. But as I said, because of the false belief that they were required to go to these precinct meetings, Benner, as well as other Mennonite brethren, went to them. When Benner went to the meeting, he was asked how many war bonds or war stamps, and Benner said none. That made people upset, but nothing happened. Another local Mennonite brother did the same thing. The precinct meeting chairman asked how many war stamps, and this brother proceeded to say, show him Benner's letter. The chairman asked him, is this your conviction? And the Mennonite brother said yes. So the chairman dismissed him to his chair and said, then you don't need to buy any. Well, of course, that made other people at the precinct meeting upset, asking why is this man allowed not to buy his war stamps and we're having to do this. So the chairman calls the Mennonite man brother back up to where he is, and he looks at Benner's letter again, and he keeps Benner's letter. Doesn't he return it to the brother? Well, then the chairman took the letter to the local justice of the peace, who forwarded it to the U.S. District Commissioner in Elkins, West Virginia, who forwarded it to the U.S. Department of Justice. So on April 17th, 1918, Brother Benner received a visit from a special agent from the Department of Justice. This is regarding this Benner's letter. I will read it, but this is what Brother Benner wrote. This was a letter confirming authorship of the letter that he gave to the Department of Justice special agent. And this is what Brother Benner wrote. This was originally handwritten on letterhead of the West Virginia Mission, Minister in charge, Ryan W. Benner and Robert L. Smith, written July 17, 1918, Job, West Virginia. This is to certify that I, Ryan W. Benner of Job, West Virginia, hereby acknowledge the authorship of the letter written to Jason Lambert and 14 other members of our church in which I speak, of the instructions from our conference in Dell Enterprise, Virginia, relative to the purchase of war saving stamps, which took place on June 28, 1918, in which instructions were contained in the letter received from Brother Heatwell dated June 15th, this is like his testimony, 1918, in which I have this date turned over to Special Agent Skelly, Department of Justice. So now the Department of Justice has now come to Benner and asked him, did you write this letter? And he affirmed that he did, and this is his affirmation. It gets worse. So the special agent took Benner's letter, Benner's affirmation of the letter, and Heatwell's letter. So now he has the letters from both pastors. Heatwell's letter that said, we don't buy war bonds. We don't support the war machine. So now you have the letters from both men now in the hands of the Department of Justice. So let's just read what happens next. The World, Martinsburg, West Virginia, Saturday, July 27, 1918, and we'll zoom in. Read what it says. Mennonite told people not to purchase war saving stamps. Roundup County preachers advised against purchase of stamps, wrote letters to the congregation asking them not to buy any stamps. Authorities charged that he received instructions from higher-ups. Now, this is what the first paragraph in that article says, and I was like, okay, this is what they say. One of the most daring resistance of government laws in West Virginia, yet reported to the office of District Attorney Stuart W. Walker, has resulted in the arrest of R.W. Benner, a Mennonite preacher stationed at a small town in Randolph County. When I read that, it's like one of the most daring resistance of government laws in West Virginia. That's a pretty strong statement. You wrote technically private letters between members of the local congregation, and that's now one of the most daring resistances. Now we're going to skip over and read some testimony of Brother Benner when he gets arrested. This testimony is pretty powerful. So let's just read what Brother Benner says. A few days later, a U.S. Marshal came to arrest me. Benner made the comment, I figured out afterward that he was just completely shocked when he saw my wife and her covering and saw me as a minister. He evidently was looking for an outlaw of some kind. It's a pretty powerful testimony, both for him and for are sisters. It meant something to this U.S. Marshal when he came to arrest Benner, seeing, like I said, a woman dressed modestly, wearing a head covering. The U.S. Marshal, this is during the train trip back to Elkins, West Virginia, asked Benner, I am puzzled about you, look at what he said, Midianites, not wanting to take up arms and fight. The Midianites you read about in the Bible were wonderful fighters. Benner replied that the Mennonites are an entirely different group. Benner said that the Midianites in the Bible were good fighters and they were a heathen nation. The Mennonites are the church of the Savior who take the teachings of Christ literally. This is from Benner's own testimony when he on the train ride during the to Elkins, West Virginia. Benner was kept at the local jail in Elkins, West Virginia for 3 nights and 2 days before being released on bail. When Benner got back, he found out the U.S. Marshal there who said, give my regards to your wife and the babies. So Benner did leave a powerful testimony with that U.S. Marshal, something I think about ourselves. When we have interaction with other people, be it normal people or law enforcement, can we have that same powerful testimony about something that happened? Because of the strong patriotic feelings there in Job, West Virginia and the surrounding area, Benner and his family left West Virginia and went to Shenandoah Valley in Virginia and later to Sourton, Pennsylvania. The grand jury date had been originally set for September 17, 1918. Brother Benner was arrested around July 18, 19, somewhere in that time period. Could not find a specific date, but in that time period, July 8th, 17th, 18th, 1918. And the trial date, the grand jury date was set for approximately 2 months later. So Brother Benner chose, these are 3 Mennonite brethren, C.H. Brunk, S.H. Rhodes, and J.S. Martin to assist them in the case. Then they chose U.S. Senator George Conrad of Harrisonburg to be their attorney, and I'm assuming that he was an attorney and a U.S. senator at the same time during the first part of August 1918. One of the first matters of business after meeting Senator Conrad was to retrieve all of those letters that Benner had sent to all the Mennonite brethren that in West Virginia. Benner was able to retrieve all but one of the letters. Senator Conrad went to Martinsburg, West Virginia and Washington, D.C. and found out, as he was learning about the case, he found out that the authorities should have also arrested Brother Hebel as well. They had only arrested Brother Benner, but they should have arrested both of them, and that plays a key role in this. Then that is because Brother Hebel had wrote the first letter that now is in the hands of the Department of Justice, and Benner had quoted Brother Hebel's letter in his own letter, the one that he mailed to everybody or physically delivered. So they both men were implicated. And there you go. So we're going to now skip and read a letter that was written between the Department of Justice and the U.S. Attorney of Martinsburg, West Virginia, dated September 3rd, 1918. There's a copy of the letter. I will put it where we can all read it. But it's pretty powerful what the U.S. Department of Justice thinks about us Mennonites for those who are anti-war. September 3rd, 1918, Stuart W. Walker, starting Sir. In response to your communication on August 30th, 1918, on the subject of the prosecution against Brian W. Benner, the Department on reflection agrees with you that this may furnish an opportunity to obtain, in a proceeding before the grand jury, further information concerning the anti-war activities of the Mennonites. It also furnishes an opportunity to test out the meaning of bona fide advice in the amended Section 3 of the Espionage Act. The Department agrees with you that the advice referred to as advice from an investment point of view does not include advice on religious grounds. The Department quite approves of you proceeding with this case in the manner indicated by you and requests that you forward as promptly as possible all information that you, I think I must have received relating to the anti-war activities of the Mennonites. In accordance with your request, copies of the Gospel Herald are herewith returned. Respectfully, for the Attorney General, signed John Lord O'Brien, Special Assistant for the Attorney General for War Work. Because from the Department of Justice, what they viewed, the anti-war activities of the Mennonites, and was pleased that somebody was doing something about it. Now we're going to just briefly look at this newspaper here. As we zoom in, it was on 2 pages. We're just going to zoom in, just look briefly at what it says. This newspaper, you look at it, is The World again, Martinsburg, West Virginia, Monday, September 9th, 1918. Let's zoom in and look at what it says there. Big test case in next federal court session here. Colonel Walker's office expected to set a precedent for Attorney General to follow. Mennonites said to have violated Espionage Act. Preachers asked their congregations to refuse to buy Liberty bonds because they're making big news. Okay. So we're going to go back, before we go to the trial and stuff, we're going to go back for a second. In Senator Conrad's investigation, this is what he found out. This is his own words. There was no dispute as to what the facts were, inasmuch as the representatives of government have concluded that the writing of these letters and mailing them was a violation of the law. It was considered proper for both Reverend Benner and Bishop Heatwall to accept the conclusion that the government officials had reached and to pay such fine as might be placed upon them. As it said, this was more or less an open and shut case according to what the government said. They have these letters that are speaking out against war bonds and against war. They're in the government's possession, an open and shut case. So we're going to now skip to more or less the day of the indictment. On September 17, 1918, Senator Conrad informed the brethren that both Brother Heatwall and Benner would both be taken, and each would be fined $1,000, which is approximately $20,000 in their own money. What makes this hard, I get a little bit choked up when I say this, this was September 17, 1918, that they find this out about Benner and Heatwall. But guess what happens? Maybe they was right, maybe it's wrong. I'm going to leave it because we didn't live there. The brethren decided not to tell Bishop Heatwall until the next day. So, Attorney Conrad sends Bishop Heatwall a telegram, please come to Martinsburg, West Virginia tomorrow morning, September 18th. They moved the date of the federal grand jury the next day. Later, J.S. Martin either sends him a telegram or leaves a message to Brother Heatwall again. Please get off at the Winchester, Virginia train station and we'll drive together in a car up to Martinsburg, West Virginia. And that's all it said. How would you like it if you get on the train about 5 in the morning from near Harrisonburg, Virginia, and you get to Winchester, Virginia about 7:40, Justin picks me up, and we get in the car and we're going to drive to Martinsburg, West Virginia. And on the way, he says, by the way, Andre, you've been indicted by the federal government. You could be sent to jail for 10 years and have a fine of $20,000. And that's the first you've heard of it, the day of the federal indictment. That's what happened to Brother Heatwall. He doesn't hear about it till 7:45, 8 in the morning on September 18th, 1918. And at 2 o'clock that afternoon, he's going to be in front of the federal grand jury saying if he's guilty or not. About 6 hours later, when I read that testimony, I was like, whoa. And this brother was 66 years old when this happened to him. I was like, yes. So this is what happened. Like I said, Brother Heatwall and Brother Benner were both jointly indicted and separately indicted. And the Mennonite brother said this, things look very gloomy and it seemed there was nothing but darkness ahead. So in our great distress and helplessness, Brother Rhodes proposed we would take the matter to our Heavenly Father in secret prayer. We knelt there. At first, Bishop Heatwall did not want to plead guilty, but then Attorney Conrad explained to him more about the indictment, and Heatwall agreed to plead guilty. So the court/federal grand jury, because it went to court, but it wasn't, because of pleading guilty, they went to court, they didn't have the grand jury, met at 2 p.m. on on September 18th, 1918. I'm just going to read you what was said. I asked my dad about one of these statements because it's a pretty weird statement. Let's read this. The Heatwall-Benner case, the United States Court, Martinsburg, West Virginia, September 18th, 1918. Judge Alton Dayton, United States Judge, presiding. This is the District Attorney, the U.S. Attorney Walker's address to the court. If Your Honor please, the joint case, the United States versus Heatwald-Benner, is presented for your consideration. Reverend L.J. Heatwald of Dell Enterprise, Virginia, who is bishop in the Mennonite Church, and Reverend R.W. Benner of Job, West Virginia, in charge of a mission at that place for the same denomination, have been indicted by the grand jury of this court, are held in charge of a violation of the espionage law. Through correspondence of last summer, by which the former conveyed to the latter, by letter, instructions that forbade members of his church to buy war savings stamps, and the latter by conveying the same instructions to his members, the grand jury finds a case in which the honor and dignity of the United States government has been disregarded in maintaining its espionage laws. I underlined that word, honor and dignity, because I didn't know what it was referring to. Yes. This is what little Senator Conrad address to the court is. If Your Honor please, I am personally acquainted with both of them, and since they are ministers of the gospel, neither having before violated the law, and further since both represent a denomination whose people have for centuries stood for the principle of non-resistance in time of peace as well as in time of war, and in view of the fact that the act of Bishop Heatwald in conveying to Reverend Benner information as to the attitude of the church in the time of war was done on solicitation of the latter and members of his church in West Virginia, it would not be militant against the dignity of the law to allow the fullest degree of clemency for this case. District Attorney Walker's rejoinder. If Your Honor please, the prosecution is ready with the court's permission to recognize for the defense the plea of guilty, and since the honor and dignity of the United States government has been violated only technically, and since Bishop Heatwald wrote what he did from the promptings of a zeal which he had for a creed which I myself am not able to understand, and since it appears from the fact in the case that both ministers were acting in the full capacity of their calling, the dignity of the espionage law can be sustained by reducing the maximum fine to $1,000 and costs for each, with the understanding the offense be not repeated and that the fines and costs be paid within 30 days from the date. The agreement between the counsel was accepted by Judge Dayton, and the brethren were once dismissed. You might be asking, when I asked my dad, what is honor and dignity supposed to mean of the espionage law? And he said that's just a quote, a nice way of saying that we want to prosecute you. It doesn't mean anything. And when I read it, it's like, honor and dignity? How does the law have honor and dignity? What is that supposed to mean? That means there really isn't something there. It's just, yes, making something up type thing. We're not quite done with this. This is what the Department of Justice then read right after. They sent a telegram from U.S. Attorney Walker to the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. This Attorney General, Washington, D.C., grand jury indicted Bishop Heatwald of Virginia and Reverend Benner of the Mennonite Church, both of whom have entered pleas of guilty and each were fined $1,000 in costs. That was dated September 18, 1918. This is a newspaper headline from the next day again. Martinsburg Journal, Martinsburg, West Virginia, the next day. And just look at this little headline right here. Mennonites fined $1,000. As I said, it was in the paper that fast. It made national news. What did the Mennonite brothers said in the Mennonite record book? His name was J. Snively Martin. Gave the total case cost for the case, including the fines, at $2,270.97, which the church paid. That's approximately $46,000 of our money today. So this is a pretty big fine. When you hear $1,000, okay, whatever. That's a lot of money. We would consider $46,000 a lot of money for us in our time. That was a lot of money for them in 1918. And the other thing that Brother Martin said is this. This action was not only intended to punish the brethren, but also set a precedent and a warning to all others in and out of the church. And that's what I think is why they were doing this. The government, we're doing these different cases to say, we are watching you, we're going to make an example of you. Well, we're not quite done. We're going to look a little bit more at Brother Heatwald. Remember what I said. How would we feel? 7:45, 8:50 in the morning. We get told we have been indicted by the federal government. We could be up to a sentence of 10 years or fine of $10,000 to $20,000. And we're going to go to the grand jury at 2 p.m. afternoon. Remember, he was 66 years old. He made this statement about it. He writes in his own church record book that September 18th, 1918 was indeed a dark day in his life. I was greatly prostrated physically and suffered extreme mental anguish that well nigh broke my heart. It really, I don't blame this dear brother for taking this the way he did. I would take that way if I was being 49 if I got told that. And I think if 66 or older, it's like you get told in the morning, hey, if you don't plead guilty, you're going to go to jail. That's a pretty big shock. So Brother Hewell wrote 2 letters asking for clemency. He wrote one about a week later on September 25th, 1918, and he writes again in March. And of course, he was both letters, his clemency was denied. But I was just going to read a little couple comments from both of his second letter. I don't have the first letter, and then what the Department of Justice says about the asking for clemency. So we're going to look briefly at Hewell's letter. He wrote this because he saw in the paper, as I pointed out about Brother Garrity's, that President Wilson was issuing clemency and pardons for those who were convicted under the Espionage Act. So he got his hopes up. Maybe he could, quote, get a pardon to purge his record from what happened to him. So here's just what I'm just going to read. That's just about, there's a couple sentences. That's a copy of his official letter. We're just to read a couple of his sentences. For nearly 40 years of my past life, my duty as minister and bishop has occasionally called me into several counties of the state of West Virginia. All this time, I had lived in all good conscience towards God and men, telling the government that he's been a minister and bishop for approximately 40 years of his life, that he was ordained in his early 20s. Like I said, he's 66, going to 67. Then he brings up September 18th again. But since the 18th day of September 1918, the general public is aware that I am made a subject for deep humiliation and hardship. On the recommendation from your department that I be arraigned before the United States Court at Martinsburg, West Virginia, for what has developed to have been a mere technical violation of the espionage law. And he brings this up. I have given more than 30 years of service free of charge as observer for the Department of the U.S. Weather Bureau from Dell Enterprise, Virginia. He was one of the ones who reported the data from his locale to the government for weather. He did that every day. And then as he near the end, he says, fond hopes are entertained that the stigma of humiliation and reproach may be in my case removed and my former good name again be restored to me. Very humbly but sincerely, L.J. Hewell. Well, here's the response by U.S. Attorney Walker. I'm just going to read the last quote of his letters. Here's his letter that he wrote between the Department of Justice officials. The U.S. attorneys are under the Department of Justice, just in case you weren't aware of that, that they're all in the same department. And I'm just going to read it was just approximately a 2-page letter. We're just going to read the last little bit here. This letter Hewell's letter was dated March 6, 1919. U.S. Attorney Walker's dated March 13, 1919. Let's just read this last paragraph. Sir, and this is skipping near the bottom of the paragraph, remembering the facts in this case as I do, I should not recommend, but on the contrary would protest, if I may be allowed to use this word, against executive interference. It was a flagrant violation of the law, and it was only by reason of the fact that these people, see that word, pretended. He does not have a high regard for Mennonites and for those who taking the teaching of Jesus seriously, pretended to be doing so under some religious theory that I consented to recommend a fine instead of incarceration. Respectfully, Stewart W. Walker. Of course, Brother Hewell didn't receive clemency or pardon to have that charge removed from him. It's, like I said, a pretty powerful little statement that Walker and all these others have said. And we'll conclude with this thing, as we conclude. Brother Benner, as I said, left West Virginia. He moved to Montana with his family for approximately 2 years. He came back. He met the precinct chairman who had turned him in, and Brother Benner acted like nothing ever happened. Later on, Brother Benner was able to lead that precinct chairman to Christianity, showing love for our enemies. So I hope today, this will be, like I said, we're going to have several of these. This gives us 3 examples of men who suffered for the teachings of Jesus, and who were, like I said, charges were brought against them under the Espionage Act of 1917 and with its amendments of 1918. We'll be looking at some more next time. So my father is going to help me real quickly fill any questions. And I hope, yes, I enjoyed the research, as you all probably know. I hope you all have enjoyed it. We have done, my wife has also, I express thanks to her for helping me put these slides together. We have spent a good amount of time just finding this information.